830 American fighter aircraft were shipped across an ocean and painted in Royal Air Force colors. Yet none of them would be used by RAF squadrons in combat over the European theater.
This is the story of what happened when the British Royal Air Force looked
at the largest single-engine fighter America ever built and quietly said no. And then, 3,000 miles away, in a country most of them had never seen, said yes. It is a story that begins in a fog-bound English airfield in the winter of 1943.
Belligerent.
And ends in a scrapyard on the edge of Singapore.
Cross Thrandro.
3 years later, in between the most uncomfortable moral questions 3 theaters of war and one of the Royal Air Force ever asked itself. The winter of early 1943 settled heavy over Cambridgeshire.
Fog crept across the grass at Royal Air Force.
Duxford, muffling the sound of engines and swallowing the outlines of the hangars. Inside the operations building, the air was thick with coal smoke, cigarette ash, and the particular smell of wet wool that clung to any British airfield in that season.
Joe?
On a scarred oak table in the technical office, a single stack of files waited for the man who would decide the fate of an American fighter aircraft at Express most of his pilots had never wanted in the first place. The man was Group Captain Alan Farquhar Campbell Ord.
Journey, sir. Terror.
44 years old, a veteran of the previous war, quiet in speech and precise in judgment. He commanded the Air Fighting Development Unit, a small but influential body of test pilots and engineers whose job was to weigh every new fighter against the machines already flying with fighter command.
His
signature at the bottom of a report could open a production line or close one. His unit did not choose which aircraft Britain would build. It decided which aircraft Britain would fight in. The file in front of him bore a name that already had a shape in the popular imagination. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Americans called it the Jug, a nickname derived from the profile of a milk bottle turned on its side. The British ground crews used the same word, but with a different tone. To them, the aircraft did not resemble a bottle. It resembled a piece of industrial machinery that had somehow been fitted with wings by mistake. Campbell Ord opened the folder. The first page was a table of numbers. At 20,000 feet, the P-47C had produced a maximum speed of 347 miles per hour.
Dart.
Jason Solemn. On the adjacent, the Spitfire Mark V in service across half a dozen theaters had produced 370 on the same day, at the same altitude, in the 23 miles per hour. In the tight arithmetic of aerial combat, that was not a gap. That was a verdict. The climb rates were
Besso Esser O 18 Casher.
The Spitfire generously retained the advantage in climb and agility. At higher altitudes, however, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged performance, though our evaluators still preferred the Spitfire MKIX for European fighter operations. European fighter. Could still push 2,700 feet per minute to 20,000. Slipped to 2,200, then lower. By 25,000 feet, the deficit was severe enough that his test pilots had underlined the figure twice. In the margin, one of them had written a single sentence in careful pencil.
Jana Taberter.
Can this aircraft even catch the enemy? Campbell Ord turned the page. The dimensions of the Thunderbolt were the second problem. Loaded
Joe
in 1/3 seam id.
Joe.
Anyone, a Spitfire, fully armed and fueled, came in at around 6 fighters was, quite literally, more than twice the aeroplane. That mass showed in every metric a fighter pilot cared about.
Longer take, off, roll.
slower initial shell acceleration, stubborn refusal to change direction at low speed. The pilots described the controls as heavy, the yoke as reluctant, the aircraft as slow to answer. Around Duxford, the standing joke had already begun to circulate.
The best way to evade an enemy fighter in a Thunder.
The joke went was to undo your straps, run around bolt. The joke went was to undo your nuff and run around the cockpit. There was more than enough room. It was also true. The cockpit of the P-47 was the largest of any single-engine fighter of the war. A pilot of average height could sit upright with room to spare, could reach every control without leaning, could shift his weight during a long escort without cramp.
Bracerizzo, Oi captured chase. Laylas, the war.
Was flown at the Luftwaffe test facility at Rechlin. The German test pilot, Hans Werner Zerk Lerche, would write in his report that the American cockpit was designed for a man, not for a mechanic to fold a man into.
General Ulf Gatter Galland,
31 years old, commander of the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe, remarked with the fighter arm of the Luftwaffe that the cockpit drowned more than 100 of aircraft. He was not being generous. He was being accurate. But size and comfort did not win wars. Speed and climb did. Campbell Ord, read the recommendation on the final page of the file. It had been drafted by his senior technical officer, and it did not require much interpretation. The Thunderbolt was judged less suitable for the interceptor role over Northern Europe than the Spitfire MKIX and the emerging Mustang, despite its excellent high-altitude performance and rugged construction.
So,
the Spitfire Mark IX, then entering full production with its two-stage Merlin 61 engine, was faster in level flight, faster in the climb, and more agile at every altitude that mattered.
But
if the Royal Air Force, you Proust.
Or
does an Air Force needed of the British Isles, or for the offensive sweeps across the Channel? The answer was not sitting crate from Farmingdale, New York. The answer was already rolling off a line at Castle Bromwich. The finding was not delivered in dramatic language.
Lace?
It was delivered as a summary of data, and said, in effect, that the Thunderbolt was the wrong aircraft for this war in this theater. The decision moved up the chain, was reviewed by the Directorate of Fighter Operations, was considered against the broader question of what the Royal Air Force needed in the coming year.
The
Fighter Command would not equip its European squadrons with the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Spitfire and the coming Merlin-powered Mustang would carry the offensive over occupied France and Germany. The American heavyweight would not fly against the Focke-Wulf 190 in RAF F colors. This was the first quiet twist in the story of the Thunderbolt in British service.
Duration.
What actually happened at Duxford in the winter of 1943 was a technical evaluation, cold and clinical, that concluded the aircraft was not needed. And what actually happened after that, over the following months, was more consequential still.
Because the Thunderbolts kept coming.
The Lend-Lease Agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom had been signed in March of 1941, and its logic did not bend to the findings of a single test unit in Cambridgeshire. The American factories were producing P-47s in enormous numbers. Republic Aviation. At Farmingdale, the second line at Evansville in Indiana, the third at Buffalo in New York. The aircraft were being built, and a share of them had been allocated to Britain. 830 airframes in total would eventually be transferred to the Royal Air Force.
The Ledger. Purse more.
240 of the early Razorback boys. None of them would fly later Camargue prejudice. This was the second quiet twist. The rejection of the Thunderbolt for the Europe did not send the aircraft back to America.
Though,
in the deliberations of the Air Ministry, a question was raised that had no easy answer. What do you do with 830 heavy fighters that your best evaluator decided you do not want? The answer arrived through a different three. The situation in the Far East was becoming urgent.
the Japanese offensive into India had not yet begun. But,
bang. The 14th Army under General Slim was rebuilding from the disastrous retreat of 1942. The Royal Air Force presence in India and Burma was equipped with a mix of tired Hurricanes, some elderly Curtiss P-40s,
Brevins?
and a limited number of Spitfires, the theater, in the previous September. The demand for a heavy fighter bomber with long-range, robust construction and the ability to carry a substantial load of bombs was constant and unmet. The Typhoon, which was performing that role in Europe, had never been sent east.
There was no plan to send it. They're past the same.
The Thunderbolt fitted the requirement almost perfectly. Its range was long. Its airframe was strong. Its 8 machine guns could tear apart a Japanese truck column or a supply barge on a Burmese river. And it was, above all, available. The decision was not announced with fanfare.
But
over the course of late 1943 and into the early months of 1944, the Thunderbolts began to move. They moved by ship, by convoy, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, to the assembly depots of Karachi and Bangalore.
they were
Destined for a war that, in Fighter Command, had duck-sittered. They were destined performance figures. They were destined for the jungle. His work at the Air Fighting Development Unit would not follow them, continued through the war and beyond. He would test the Mustang and the Tempest and the first jets. His signature on the Thunderbolt file marked a decision that closed one door in Cambridgeshire. But that decision opened another door 6,000 miles away, at a training airfield outside Bangalore called Yelahanka.
Jan and
And the men who would first fly the American
Orkan aircraft. Colors in Royal Air Force.
would not be the pilots of the European swoops. They would be Hurricane veterans of the Burma retreat, tired, sunburnt, and utterly unprepared for what was about to be handed to them. The verdict of Duxford was final. But the verdict was not the end of the story.
It was only the moment when the story turned.
Yelahanka lay 8 degrees north of the Cambridgeshire winter, but the two places had nothing else in common. In June of 1944, the airfield outside Bangalore baked under a sun that a British pilot could feel through the crown of his cap.
The runway.
Was long enough for heavy transports. The dispersal areas smelled of dust, aviation fuel, and the sweet rot of tropical vegetation that pressed in at the perimeter. This was the home of No. 167 Zero Conversion Unit, and this was where the men of the Royal Air Force in Southeast Asia Command would learn to fly the aircraft that Europe had declined to accept.
Their mission bus.
From this 6, Hapsus, was squadron leader Leonard Charles Cookson Hawkins. He was in his 20s, holder of the distinguished Flive Squadron. He had flown Hurricanes in the Burma theater in the preceding period. He had lost pilots. He had lost aircraft. He had been promised a new machine, and now he stood on the dispersal at Yella and looked at what the promise had produced.
Yes.
The Thunderbolt was not what any of them had produced, had imagined. The pilots who walked around it in that first hour did so in silence. Some of them had never seen an aircraft that size outside of a bomber squadron.
Bet Chetes.
The tailplane stood taller than a man. The cowling of the Pratt and Whitney Double Wasp was a black wall of engine, 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 banks, capable of over 2,000 horsepower and more than 2,300 on emergency boost with water injection. To reach the cockpit, a pilot had to climb onto the wing root, using a fold-out step that clicked out from the fuselage. There was no such step on a Hurricane. On a Hurricane, you simply put your foot in a stirrup and pulled yourself up. Doesn't so small things. That was one of 100 small things that told you immediately. The men of the conversion unit had been trained to notice these things. Their job was to translate, to take a pilot who had flown a Hurricane weighing barely half as much loaded with a Merlin engine and a manual undercarriage, and turn him into a pilot, Prey Systems, who could handle a 14,000-pound American fighter, sometimes 17,000 with a full bomb load, powered by a turbocharger and a fuel system that carried more empty weight of a Sopwith Camel from the previous. It was not a matter of learning a new aircraft.
Zepper.
It was a matter of learning a new philosophy of flight. The Hurricane, in the hands of a man who understood it, was an instrument. The pilot moved, and the aircraft answered. The connection was intimate, sometimes brutal, but always direct. You banked the machine by leaning your shoulder into the turn. You knew the airframe was near its limit because they had dismounted as the wine tips began to shudder. At the moment before touched, a pilot did not fly it in the same sense. He managed it. He set the manifold pressure. He watched the turbo pressure gauge. He adjusted the mixture. He monitored the cylinder head temperature. And if he did all of those things correctly, the aircraft flew itself with a kind of ponderous inevitability. The stick was heavy. The rudder pedals required force. Nothing was quick.
But everything was reliable. And everything was strong. And everything was, above all, built to bring the pilot home. SQN.
LLDR Hawkins understood this within his first flight. His logbook does not contain lyrical passages. It contains times, altitudes, headings, and terse comment. But the pilots who trained under him at Yellowhonka in those weeks remembered a change in his manner. He had converted. He had accepted that the machine he had been given was not a Hurricane and was never going to behave like a Hurricane, and that trying to fly it as if it were one would kill him.
Ranger
And the 15 others that his squadron. The lessons in the same way. Not with enthusiasm, with the discipline of men who had already been at war for 2 or 3 years and who had run out of energy for enthusiasm. The conversion was not without cost. Training accidents happened. Heavy aircraft demanded long runways, and the airstrips of India in the summer of 40-40s. So sometimes soft, sometimes short, sometimes edged with the kind yield to an tropical trees that geld on landing, leaks, were common in the first weeks. Engine failures during initial climb were not unknown. The Pratt & Whitney was reliable when it was cared for by mechanics who understood it, but the mechanics were still learning too. Each squadron sent its ground crews to conversion courses in parallel with its pilots. And each squadron in its own time, some squadron of the captureds, discovered time, and by its own accidents, the specifics Squircus Cofree in one scription Sixertrum's frame. In the middle of that hot and dusty summer, the third twist of the story began to make itself visible. The Thunderbolt had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor. That was its purpose. That was what the engineers at Farmingdale had drawn, tested, and refined. The 2-stage turbocharger, the enormous ducting running the length of the fuselage, the exhaust manifolds routed through the rear structure. The entire philosophy of the aircraft. All of it was aimed at fighting other fighters at 25,000 feet and above.
That was the war in Europe.
That was the war Republic Aviation had built the Jug win. That was not the war in Burma. In Burma, the fight was on the deck. The Japanese Army Air Force still contested the skies in 1944, but the intensity of the air-to-air battle was declining.
The real war, the 14th Army needed, the Royal Air Force,
was against ground targets.
Tracks.
Truck columns on jungle tracks, river barges on the Chindwins, supply dump ends under the trees, artillery positions dug into ridge lines, bunkers reinforced with logs and earth, airfields at Maktila and Heiho and Magway. The war in Burma required an aircraft that could carry a heavy bomb load, endure ground fire, and remain in the air long enough to loiter until a forward air specific controller called it down onto a specific target. The Thunderbolt could do all of that. It could probably do it better than the Spitfire. It could carry 2 500-pound bombs under the wings and a third under the belly. Its .850 caliber machine guns could strip the roof off a Japanese lorry at 300 yards.
Right.
Its armor plating meant that ground fire that would have killed a Hurricane pilot outright often did nothing more than punch neat holes in the fuselage of a Jug. But the aircraft that had been judged too heavy for European interception turned out to be, almost by accident, one of the most effective ground attack fighters available for the Burma campaign. Although designed primarily as a high-altitude escort and interceptor, the Thunderbolt proved exceptionally effective in the fighter-bomber role in Burma.
Direct.
And the men of the Burma squadrons, once they understood what they had been given, began to use it. The first operational sortie came on the 14th of September, 1944. The squadron was number 261. Its history stretched back to 1918 and forward through some of the most bitterly contested air fighting of the Second World War. In the summer of 1940, Prus, and the spring of 1941, its pilots had flown Sea Gladiators and Hurricanes over Malta, defending the island against the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe during the Great Siege. Some of the men who had survived Malta were still with the squadron. 3 years they had followed the war east through Iraq and Palestine, to India, to Burma. They had flown Hurricane 2Cs in the rearguard actions against the Japanese advance and in the slow, punishing counteroffensive that followed.
Sure.
And now, on a September morning in Sinasam, they were preparing to take their new American fighters across the Chindwin River and into the airspace of occupied Burma. The base was Kumbirgram,
Journeys.
80 kilometers east of Kraft,
East Impulse.
cut out of the hills and the tea plantations, surrounded by monsoon, swollen streams and the low green ridges that led toward the Burma frontier. The ground crews had worked through the night to prepare the aircraft. The pilots ate breakfast in the mess tent, under electric lights, strung from bamboo poles.
Drenaceps.
The briefing was short. Armed reconnaissance across the Chindwin. Look for troop movements, transport targets of opportunity. Return by mid-morning. Take no chances with an aircraft that most of the pilots had less than 20 hours on. The Thunderbolts lifted off in pairs. The sound of the double Wasps running full boost at the start of the takeoff roll carried across the tea gardens and into the hills. It was a heavier sound than the Merlin.
Yepper.
Deeper. Slower. The aircraft climbed out toward the east, silhouettes against the sunrise, and turned toward the river that had been the boundary of the war for 2 years.
They found Obe.
That is how most armed reconnaissance missions ended. A few boats on the river strafed briefly. A truck moving on a track under the trees engaged and left burning. The pilots came home landed heavily, taxied to the dispersals, and reported what they had seen. There were no losses.
There were no
Aerial engagements. There was, by the standards of the war, nothing remarkable at all. That was the fourth quiet twist in the story. The great American fighter entered service with the Royal Air Force in the most understated way possible, not in a great air battle. Not against enemy fighters.
No, in armed cess.
In an armed sweep who had learned their train on over the Mediterranean and their patience over the Bay of Bengal. 2 days later, on the 16th of September, the same squadron dropped the first Royal Air Force bombs from Thunderbolts, 6 500-pound weapons released against Japanese positions across the Chinjin.
Again, the tensions. Again, tensions.
Again, no losses. Again, no fanfare. The war in Burma did not produce fanfare. It produced entries in the operational record books initialed by the intelligence officer, filed with the group headquarters,
Election Wenham prejudice.
and forgotten by everyone except the men who had been there. Through October and November, the other squadrons came into operations. Number 135, Hawkins commanding. Number 76, number 5, number 30. Number 30, number 123. Number 134, number 25. 8, 16 squadrons in total would eventually fly the Thunderbolt in the theater. All of them had previously flown the Hurricane. All of them were 3rd Tactical Air sporting the 14th Army. And all of them, in the space of a few months, adopted the same operating method. The method was called the cab rank.
The cab rank was not an American invention.
It had been developed in Europe by the men who flew the Hawker Typhoon in support of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, refined during the advanced across North and into the Low Countries. The idea was simple. A flight of ground attack fighters, loaded with bombs and ammunition, would loiter medium altitude over the front line. On the ground, a forward air controller, usually a pilot at the end of his operational tour reassigned to a mobile radio truck, would identify targets that were holding up the advancing infantry.
He would call the aircraft
Down by voice, one at a time. Like a doorman summoning taxis, each aircraft would attack in turn, then climb back to altitude to await the next call. The system meant that ground troops always had air support within minutes, sometimes seconds, of requesting it.
It also
meant that pilots knew exactly what they were attacking, because a man on the ground with a map, a set of eyes, was telling them. In Burma, the cab rank was adapted to the jungle.
the forward
Controllers
ord we pensions.
Vutch controllers just moved with the leading brigades of the 14th Fortune Army into positions where they could see empty positions, bunkers, or artillery sluxis movements that were invisible from the air. Their radio traffic was terse. A location, though, a target, a heading.
Giraffe?
The Thunderbolts overhead, off, one at a time, dived to the deck, delivered their bombs or their gunfire, and climbed back to hold. On a good day, a single flight of 4 aircraft could stay on station for an hour, attacking a dozen separate targets, and land back at base with fuel to spare once.
The 14th Army learned to depend on it. Thirdicher, Derceptilis.
Number 42 Squadron, in the advance on Rangoon in the following spring, would be officially commended for its attacks against Japanese 105mm artillery pieces that had been holding up the ground advance. The commendation did not name the pilots.
Grenade, Joe Latcher.
It tamed the squadron and the type, and the effect on the tactical situation. Individual glory was not the currency war. The currency was the movement of the front line and the number of Japanese guns that no longer fired.
But
No amount of tactical skill could solve. But the Thunderbolts had a problem that had nothing to do with the enemy. It looked, from certain angles and at certain distances, exactly like a Japanese aircraft.
RAF.
The Japanese Army Air Force operated several radial-engined fighters that shared in silhouette the essential features of the American design. The Nakajima Ki-44's radial engine profile could, under poor visibility or at long range, be mistaken for a Thunderbolt by inexperienced observers, increasing the risk of friendly fire.
This
was not a theoretical problem. This was a lethal one. The 14th Army fought alongside American units. American aircraft flew in the same skies. American anti-aircraft gunners defended American forward bases. And in the intensity of a combat environment, if a gunner, or a pilot who saw a large radial-engined fighter approaching had approximately 1 second to decide, the wrong decision meant a burst of .50 caliber fire.
What?
A burst of .50 caliber fire from an American. And was just as fatal to share from an American gun, was just as fatal to a Royal Air Force pilot. A solution from Wisconsin gun and visible from any range, Thunderbolt operating in Southeast Asia, were marked with prominent white recognition bands on the wings and tail to reduce the risk of friendly fire. Mines
around the tail, around the wings, around the fuselage.
Around the tailplane. From any angle, the aircraft was to be immediately, unambiguously identifiable as Allied. The weapons were not subtle. They were designed to be seen at a mile in bad light. They were the difference between a pilot who came home and a pilot who did not.
This was the fifth twist of the story, and it was metas.
The Royal Air Force's greatest fear in the operation was not the Japanese enemy, it was the American enemy. The men who flew the Thunderbolts over Burma knew that Japanese pilots would try to kill them.
They accepted that. It was the war.
But the possibility of being shot down aircraft crew, or a jumpy American fighter pilot, in an American aircraft, over an Allied position, in a friendly sky, was a psychological weight that they carried on every mission. The white bands were the only insurance policy that had ever been issued against it. Through the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945, the 16 squadrons of Thunderbolts fought the war they had been given. They attacked Hee-Ho Airfield in central Burma, destroying aircraft on the ground and strafing dispersal pens.
They attacked the airfields at Meiktila, Sadr.
They struck the marshalling yards at Mandalay. They flew fighter escort for the Consolidated Liberators of the Strategic Air Force during the raids that preceded the recapture of Rangoon. Number 1-3. 4 squadrons specialized in the escort role.
Number 42 developed a particular expertise in close air support.
Number 60 and number 81 flew in the final push down the Irrawaddy Valley. The monsoon of 1944 had been the worst in living memory. The monsoon of 1945 would be worse still. Between them, the 14th Army fought the largest land campaign, the Thunderbolt scene, of the war against Japan in weather that no European operations manual had ever contemplated, that no European operations manual. The airframe suffered. The engines suffered.
The
pilots suffered from malaria, from the exhaustion that came with flying 2 or 3 sorties a day in temperatures that reach 50 degrees Celsius on the flight line. But the aircraft, the great American heavyweight, held together because it had been built to hold together. And in the war, it had never been designed to fight. That turned out to be the only quality that really mattered. On the 2nd of May, 1945, British and Indian forces entered Rangoon. The city had been evacuated by the Japanese in the days before. Nesren, and the reoccupation was almost bloodless. The Thunderbolts had flown escort for the final bomber raids on the outskirts. The 14th Army, what most military planners in London had considered impossible 3 years earlier. It had defeated the Japanese army in Burma. The war in Europe ended 6 days later. On the 8th of May, the news reached the airfields of central Burma by radio shouts and by the shouts of men running between tents. The pilots of the Thunderbolt squadrons heard it. Most of them said very little. In response, their war was not over in Sumatra and the Dutch East Indies. On the Dutch East, in the next campaigns were already being planned. The men who had learned to fly the jug over the Chindwin now waited for orders that would take them south. Take them into the tropical waters and the volcanic islands, where the last act of the Pacific War would be fought. Was still with them. So were the veterans of Malta in number 261.
Matt.
So were the surviving hurricane pilots to trust steer 10 months who had learned over the previous 10 months. To trust. To trust the aircraft. They had painted the white bands. They had watched the enemy retreat from Burma in the worst monsoon anyone could remember. They did not yet know what would happen at Batavia. The city of Batavia lay under a different kind of heat than Burma. It was flat, where Burma was mountainous. Coastal, Burma fudget landlocked. It was colonial in a way that Burma had never quite been. The Dutch had ruled these islands for more than 300 years. The Japanese had occupied them for 3.5. On the 17th of August, 1945, 2 days after the Japanese surrender was announced by radio from Tokyo, a civilian engineer named Sukarno stood in front of a small crowd in the courtyard of a house on Pegongsan, Timor, and read a declaration of independence. He was 44 years old. He had spent much of the previous decade in Dutch prisons or in exile. The document he read that morning was 2 sentences long. It declared that the Indonesian people were, from that moment, the citizens of a sovereign republic. There was no one to enforce the declaration. There was also no one to prevent it. The formal Japanese surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri would not take place until the 2nd of September, more than 2 weeks later. In those 2 weeks, in the political vacuum that opened over the archipelago, the Republic of Indonesia became a fact on the ground. The Japanese garrisons remained in place, disarmed in principle and confused in practice. The Dutch colonial authorities were scattered, imprisoned, or dead. The Americans, whose war in the Pacific was ending, had no interest in restoring European empires in Southeast Asia.
That role, defaulted by the logistics of the moment,
fell to the British. The man given the task was Lieutenant General Sir Philip Christison. He was 51 years old. He had commanded 15 Indian Corps during the Arakan campaign in Burma. He was a professional soldier of the old school, Presbyterian, precise, and, by his own private admission, uncomfortable with the mission he had been assigned. His orders from
South Mat,
East Asia, Louisy, Mountbat, were to accept the Japanese surrender in the Netherlands East Indies, to release Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees, and to maintain order until the Dutch colonial authorities could return. The order used the phrase.
Saint-Shirt Ves Bet
did not use the
Preptures Vet Chides.
But by it ought to use the phrase suppress a national 1945, when Christison landed at Batavia at the head of a force built largely from Indian Army divisions. That was what maintaining order had come to mean. The Thunderbolts arrived shortly after him.
Numsbrecher. 60s. Squadron and
Number 81 Squadron of the Royal Air Force were among the units allocated to these operations. Both had flown the Jug over Burma. Both were composed of pilots who had spent the previous year attacking Japanese positions in support of the 14th Army. Both had celebrated VJ Day in their own quiet way at their airfields in Burma or India, and both, within weeks, were flying combat operations again. Not against the Imperial Japanese Army, against Indonesian nationalists armed with rifles, machetes, captured Japanese weapons.
Jeppers.
A conviction of national purpose. In his private Qantas Sir Philip correspondence,
Jep.
admitted he understood and could not answer. This was the sixth twist of the story, and it was the darkest. The great battle came at Surabaya, on the eastern end of Java, in late October and November of 1945.
Dramatic.
A British brigadier, Aubrey Malaby, was killed in the opening days of the confrontation, shot dead in his staff car during a negotiation that broke down under circumstances that no one on either side was ever fully able to reconstruct. The British response was overwhelming. Naval bombardment.
Ground assault.
By the 23rd Indian Infantry Division under Major General Douglas Hawthorne. And in the skies above, the aircraft of the Royal Air Force, including the Thunderbolts of number 60 and number 81, striking Indonesian positions with the same techniques they had refined against the Japanese in Burma.
The cab rank system.
Adapted for the streets of an Indonesian city. The 500-pound bombs dropped onto neighborhoods that had declared themselves part of a republic that the Allies had chosen not to recognize. The pilots did what they were ordered to do. Most of them said little about it afterwards. The squadron histories from the period tend to record dates and sortie numbers and target coordinates, and to leave the larger question untouched.
The larger question was this.
The men flying these aircraft had spent the previous 3 or 4 years believing that they were fighting for the freedom of small nations against the tyranny of larger ones.
Duress, Joe, I gains. Germany. And it was the moral vocabulary of the war against Germany.
In Batavia and Surabaya, Semarang against Japan. In Batavia and Surabaya and Semarang and Bandung, that vocabulary no longer applied. It could not be made to apply. The men in the streets below the Thunderbolts were not fascists. They were not imperialists.
They were, by any reading that did not on the color of a flag on a colonial map, nationalists. The colonial map nationalists.
The Thunderbolts kept flying. At Yelahanka, 6,000 kilometers to the northwest, the conversion training that had begun in the summer of 1944 continued into the summer of 1945.
Japanese?
Among the passed through in that period was a 21-year-old sergeant pilot from the British Mandate of Palestine. His name was Esser Weizmann. He was the nephew of Chaim Weizmann, the Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader who would 3 years later become the first president
of the State of Israel. The lecture.
Esser had enlisted in the British team. He had enlisted in the British forces. He had trained in Rhodesia. He had qualified as a pilot in 1944. And in the early months of 1945, he had arrived at Yelahanka to convert onto the Thunderbolt for service in Burma. The war ended before he flew operational combat missions in
Johnny Ciro.
He would leave the Royal Air Force as sergeant pilot without operational experience. He would return to Palestine. He would join the underground. 3 years later, he would help found the Air Force of a new state.
Bloody same prejudice.
And he would fly its first fighter mission on the 9th of May, 1948, in a Czech-built Avia against an Egyptian column advancing toward Tel Aviv from the position at Izdad. Later still, he would command that Air Force. Later still, he would become the 7th president of Israel. This was the 7th twist, and it was the quietest one.
The Chet.
The Thunderbolts that had been shipped to the jungle to fight the Japanese, that had ended their war fighting Indonesian nationalists in the service of a Dutch colonial restoration, had also, in passing, trained a young man who would use what he had learned there to help build a country that did not yet exist. But
The connections between
wars are not always what we expect to be. The pilots who trained together at Aviation WWII would fight in different uniforms at Yellowhawkus in the years that followed. Some empires that were endings, some for republics that were ending, some for itself was neutral. The aircraft did not care. The end came in stages. By the middle of 1946, the Royal Air Force was drawing down its commitments across Southeast Asia. The war was over. The pilots wanted to go home.
the Let.
The Lend-Lease Agreement with the United States, which had provided the aircraft on terms that assumed they would be returned or at the end of hostilities, was being closed out. Some of the Thunderbolts were flown back to depots and prepared for disposal. Some were pushed into piles at the end of jungle airstrips and burned.
So ledgers.
Stemain charred, some were dumped into the Sapi. The exact numbers are hard to reconstruct because the disposal was carried out by exhausted men in a hurry to demobilize and because the paperwork was
Fine.
of the aircraft delivered, with only a handful survived into peacetime service anywhere in the world. Most of the rest simply disappeared.
The squadrons converted or disbanded one by one.
Number 5 and number 30 stayed in India and equipped with the Hawker Tempest II, and re-equipped with the Hawker Tempest II. Number 60 and number 81, after their long deployment in the Indonesian operations, moved to Singapore.
Or so.
Most of the other units of the
3rd Tactical Air Force.
as their pilots reached the end of their service periods and returned to civilian life in Britain, civilian in Australia, in Canada, in South Africa, in the many countries whose men had flown Hurricanes and then Thunderbolts over Burma.
The last Royal Air Force squadron to fly the Thunderbolt was number 60.
In December of 1946, at Kalong Airfield in Singapore, the squadron was formally converted to the Supermarine Spitfire. The Thunderbolts were parked, drained, stripped of useful components, and left. Some sources record that they were subsequently scrapped in place. Others suggest that a handful were transferred to other users. What is certain is that from that month, no Royal Air Force unit anywhere in the world operated the aircraft that had been the largest single-engine fighter of the Second World War.
Director.
The kingdom that had rejected the Thunderbolt at Duxford in the winter of 1943 had, in the intervening 3.5 years, operated the aircraft in greater numbers than any nation outside the United States itself. It had used the aircraft in a war for which it had never been designed. Jihad used the out when one campaign, Jokanjim.
Only aircraft win, one or.
And to help lose the political argument of another. Group Captain Alan Farquhar, Campbell Ord continued his work at the Air Fighting Development Unit through the remainder of the war. He tested the aircraft that came after.
Mustang, the Thunderbolt.
The Mustang in its Merlin-engined form. The Tempest, the Meteor jet fighter that would become the mainstay of fighter command in the early post-war years.
Joe?
He never, as far as any surviving document shows, revisited the question of whether the decision on the P-47 in the winter in the winter of 1943 had been the correct one. He did not need to. The decision had been correct for the war he had been asked to evaluate. It had also, without his knowing it or intending it, launched the aircraft on a journey that ended in places he had never considered, and in wars he had never anticipated. Squadron leader Leonard Charles Cookson Hawkins survived the war. Sergeant pilot Ezer Wiseman survived the war and lived a life that led him from a training airfield in southern India to the presidency of country. Sir Philip Christison retired to Scotland and lived until 1993. Sukarno became the first president. Tuksip became the first president of the Republic of 1949, when the Dutch, after 4 years of a colonial war that they could not sustain, finally recognized what had been proclaimed in a courtyard in Batavia on the 17th of August, 1945.
The aircraft were gone by then.
The Royal Air Force had operated one of the largest, 4 in fleets, P-47 United States, and they almost a physical trace team. A few photographs. The operational record books of the 16 squadrons that flew them, filed in the archives of the 16 largely unread. The Teknes, the recognition bands that's been once painted white against the fear of American guns, had long since faded from any surviving airframe.
What had they first flew the American? The pilots, they had said, very little.
In the end, the technical evaluators at Duxford had said the aircraft was too heavy and too slow. The Hurricanes at Yellowhawk had said, more or less, that it was not a hurricane and would have to be learned as a different kind of machine altogether. The pilots of number 26 won over the chin log entries, squadron log entries, that they had flown, they had returned, and they had lost no aircraft.
The
men of number 60 over Java had said almost nothing at all, and what they said they generally kept to themselves. The verdict of Duxford in the winter of 1943 had been that the aircraft was wrong for the war. The verdict of history 3 years and 3 campaigns later was more difficult to summarize.
The aircraft had been wrong for one war and right for another.
It had helped defeat one enemy and helped, in the shadow of that victory, to fight another that no one wanted to acknowledge as an enemy at all. It had trained pilots who would use what they had learned in the founding of a state that did not yet exist.
Zillet?
Quat, pork, that, cast. It had crossed 3 oceans and been fought in 3 theaters and ended in a scrapyard at the edge of a Singaporean airfield. The men who had flown it went home or made their homes elsewhere. The war they had fought was already, even before it ended, beginning to be forgotten. The aircraft that had carried them through it was forgotten more quickly, team. That was what the Royal Air Force pilots still. That was what the Royal Air Force pilots said, in the end, about the American P-47 Thunderbolt. They said almost nothing. And in the silence, the whole story could be heard.